was from Bethsaida of Galilee, and asked him, saying, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. Philip came and told Andrew, and in turn Andrew and Philip told Jesus. But when Jesus answered them, saying, The hour has come that the Son of Man should be glorified. Most assuredly I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces much grain. He who loves his life will lose it. He who hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. If anyone serves me, let him follow me, and where I am, there my servant will be also. If anyone serves me, him will my Father honour. Now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. But for this purpose I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Then a voice came from heaven, saying, I have both glorified it and will glorify it again. Therefore the people who stood by and heard it said that it had thundered. Others said, an angel has spoken to him. And Jesus answered and said, The voice did not come because of me, but for your sake. Now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be cast out. And if I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all peoples to myself. This he said, signifying by what death he would die. The people answered him, We have heard from the law that the Christ remains forever. And how can you say the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is this Son of Man? Then Jesus said to them, A little while longer the light is with you. Walk while you have the light, lest darkness overtake you. He who walks in darkness does not know where he is going. While you have the light, believe in the light, that you may become sons of light. Amen.
Thank you, man. Just before we went away the other day, I took a funeral down there in Penyrheol, and it was a family that I knew. I didn't know the individual concerned that was being the funeral service was for, but I had quite a contact with a number of family members, and we were in the new refurbished now Brunant chapel at Penyrheol. They've been busy down there working, and they finished it, freshened it up. Looks far, far better now, I think. Far more homely and comfortable in there. It's always difficult to know. I've always said, when you're this side of the counter, and to know what to do, what to say in a funeral, and what you should speak on, because I think you should speak on something relevant to the people concerned. It's no good just quoting a Bible verse in that sense, because 99% of them will have not a clue about what that verse relates to. And so what I do, I feel is the way that the Lord has given me, is to pick up either something from the tribute, the family tribute that they bring, or from the hymns that they choose, or something that I know about the individual concerned. And what stood out with this lady was her friendship. Friendships that went back to when she was but a girl, there playing on the tip in Singenid, or up in the woods in Singenid. And it centered around that, the relationship of friends and that type of thing. And whilst I was taking the service, I looked at this one guy that was right at the back, and he just nodded to me and smiled, and I was looking at him, and I thought, well, where have I seen him before? I just could not work out where I'd seen him before. And then as I was in full swing of the tribute, and it was quite a lengthy tribute, I think it had about 2.5 pages of full scat that they'd given to write about her. That's how popular she was. So many people had things to say about her. And right in the middle of it, it suddenly dawned on me who it was. Just a few weeks before, I'd been thinking about him. And it happens like that. I'd not seen him since 1971, the day he left school. That was the last time I saw him. He was 15, I was 15, and we parted company. He joined the army and had a life in the forces there till the day he retired. I'd heard that he'd moved back to the area, but I hadn't seen him at all. And on times when I've gone up to Abertrydydd and Singenid, I've kept my eye out for him. but never seeing him. And it suddenly, I was so taken aback by it. Because of the subject of friendship, I said, look, listen now. Just to interrupt, just an aside, just for a moment, I've just seen a bloke at the back. He's been nodding to me, smiling to me, and I've been looking at him thinking, who on earth is this fella at the back there? I realise who it is now. It's the friend that I had when I was just 15 years of age, and that's the first time I've seen him in all those years. So I don't know how many years is that. It's 48 years, look. It's amazing how time can go. But I picked up his features. Dreadfully for me, he had a full head of hair as well. But there we are, we won't go down that road. But he goes to church as well. He goes to a church down in Rubina. Not Rubina Baptist, as I thought, but a brother by the name of Brother Dunning, I think, is the pastor down there. I think it's a Baptist church or United Reformed church, I'm not quite sure, holding Bible studies and that type of thing, plus Sunday services. So after a life in the forces, he's come back and met a girl that he knew when we were just kids here at St. Andrew's Hall, when we used to go to the youth club there. They got back together via the internet, they got married, and there they are now, worshipping the Lord down there in Rubina. Marvellous. You can be thinking about things sometimes, and the very thing you're thinking about, the Lord can arrange it so that you come across him again. I know it's a bit of an aside, but he's so interested in each and every one of our thoughts. There's not an area in our life where he says, well, no, that's off limits. I don't think about those things. He does. There's nothing off limits for him, see. You think, well, who would think about me? But there we are. That's the way God is. We could have sung a chorus a little earlier on, I have a Father. And we sing that chorus, a beautiful song. When we go to Jersey, they asked me and Judith to do a duet to strike it up. I let Judith lead it. There we are. I mentioned this morning about to God be the glory, and the different instances in the Old Testament where we find that the purpose of God unfolds in two very linked areas. First, the glory of his name. He loves to have his name glorified. And to do it, he loves for all the world to do it, to know it. And so there are instances in the Old Testament, I picked out 5, I think, 4 or 5, but there are other instances that tell us of occasions when God did things through individuals or for individuals whereby his name was shed abroad. And some wonderful things came from it. Probably, certainly the first and foremost that he did was the creation itself. That he used the creation to speak to every individual on the earth. That's why in Romans it says, you are therefore without excuse. By looking at the sky, by looking at the creation around you, it can give you knowledge of one who is greater than yourself. And you are to move on from that like that. And so he says, you're without excuse. We've often wondered, haven't we? We say, well, what about those peoples in foreign lands or even in our own country that have never heard the gospel? What of them? They have the creation that has a voice speaking to it. It says, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows forth his handiwork. It speaks through the day, every day, and it speaks even at the night, through the night. Not an audible voice, although they can be an audible voice, I suppose, that can speak to you. But a voice that reaches out, that there is no speech, no language, no corner of the earth where that voice has not reached. Whether it be in the darkest of all countries, the creation itself has gone out to all of creation, for all the world to see. As I said this morning, those lovely few words that Daniel shared with that wicked, wicked king there in Persia, there is a God in heaven. And we can move on from there. And there were other instances. Paul, speaking of the creation, says that this went out into all the world, revealing his invisible attributes, his eternal power, and his divinity or deity, whatever you want to call it. That would be the greatest of all voices through the Old Testament and into the New Testament. But we find other occasions when again his name, he did things through Moses, through Joshua, through David, through Solomon, and through others, where he says, if this takes place, it will give opportunity to exalt my name around the world. And so, for when Moses crossed the Red Sea, we find that those of Philistia, the Philistines we would call them, those of Philistia, Edom, Moab, and all of Canaan became aware of a God amongst the children of Israel. The sad thing was this, that it says that all the nations of the earth might know. The sad thing is that we don't really know how far reaching those wonders were done or were able to achieve. We don't know about those things. We know of Philistia, we know of Edom, we know of Moab, we know all of Canaan. When Joshua came to the river of Jordan and sent the spies through into Jericho, it says that the people had already fainted within their hearts, hearing of the news that they'd done at the Red Sea and what they'd done to the Amorites and what had happened at the Jordan when they crossed the sea. And so it says there, again, his name, the power of his might be known throughout all the earth. We know for Joshua and his day that the Amorites became aware of what God was doing, and his name became known amongst them. We know again that all of Canaan, it says they fainted within their hearts, their spirits left them, because of the news of a God marching through the land, through a group of people that had no name amongst their own. They had no country, they had no borderland, they had no rules and regulations like the nations of the world. They were someone who were just born slaves. And yet God was amongst them, the children of Israel. Then we come to David. And we find with David that he's but a teenager and standing against this giant of a man, Goliath. We have limited information at all about the effects that had, that victory that he had over Goliath. Very little effect that we know, the ripple down effect, I suppose you would call it, of what happened. What did the nations really take a hold of it? We know, interestingly, that those that came close to him, they called the Cherethites and the Pelethites. They were Philistines. That's an amazing thing when you think of it, isn't it? It also talks about the Gittites. They are the inhabitants of Gath, where Goliath was born from. The very people that saw their hero overcome by this young teenager are the same people that give their lives to God and to David himself. I love the little instance of that man, Ittai the Gittite. It's a name to have, isn't it? There's a family up in Singeni, the Abertredo, isn't it? The Gittings family. Oh, we know about Gladys. Gladys, she was a Gittings, wasn't she? Yeah, she was a Gittings. And whenever you spoke to someone in school, in the grammar school, there was a Gitto in our class from Abertredo or Singeni. Loads of them around. But Ittai the Gittite, I wonder if he was called Gitto. I wonder if he was. It says concerning him, when David was on the run, when his son Absalom had turned the nation upside down and had David on the run, and he'd come down just the day before David was to leave the city and to hide out into the wilderness. And all David's mighty men were with him. The Gittites were with him. The Cherethites were with him. The Pelethites were with him. These close guards, the guardians of the throne then, if you wanted to, they were the close guard that we hear of in so many armies, the strategic ones that were there to defend their king and master. It says of David speaking to Ittai, Ittai, you only came yesterday. Go home. You've got no need to run with me. And he starts to go down the road, Ittai now, of the words that Ruth said to Naomi. Where you go, I go. Where you die, I die. And it says that Ittai, with his family, with his children, and with those that had come with him, followed David into the wilderness. We don't know what the ripple effect of reaching out to the world was, to the rest of the world. But for those that were there in that vicinity, even the Philistines were taken aback by what God had done. Now that was in the hands of a teenager. It's amazing what God can do. with one who makes themselves available. For Solomon, we know that he prayed that those from a far country might come and pray, and when they prayed, that God would hear them, that the nations might know the power of your name and fear you forevermore. That was his cry. We know the Queen of Sheba came. She came not as Hollywood would tell us, a love story, but she came to get converted. She had heard what God was doing, and her heart was moved. She tested him with questions and the wisdom that God had given him, not with maths and science and and history and all that, but she tested him with questions that he would bring to her truth. And it says her spirit was taken away. I've often wondered, outside of the voice of creation, these other elements that we've talked about here, I've often wondered if they have just petered away. As water would go down a drain in one sense, to drain away, it would just become something of a distant memory. And so in one sense, outside of the voice of creation, these instances are instances that really didn't, as far as we know, reach out to the whole of the world. Then we come into the New Testament. And this reading that Andrew took tells us of one who will glorify the Lord, and it will reach out to all the nations. And so we read in chapter 12, verse 27. To me, I think it's one of the finest chapters that you could ever read. It's got so much. In the early part of the chapter is where Mary is at the feet of Jesus and anointing him with that alabaster box. Then we have the dinner party, the dinner together with Lazarus, and all the people coming to see Lazarus. Not only Jesus, but coming to see Lazarus. Then we have the Greeks that come and ask Philip and Andrew, can we see Jesus? And his reply to them. Interestingly, there's no reply to them, it's a reply toward them. It's not personally spoken by Jesus back to them. He just speaks to Andrew and Philip, explaining what's going on. Then we come to this. And there's a look on the master's face. And he verbalizes it. It comes out from his lips. Now is my soul troubled. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. But it was for this hour that I've come. And then this simple prayer. Father, glorify your name. I find it marvelous sometimes that you have some prayers that hit the nail on the head as soon as the lips are opened. There are some of our prayers that we prayed and we've waxed lyrical with it. And we've gone here and we've gone there and we've gone here. Then you get someone like Moses comes up concerning his sister. Heal her now, Lord. Peter on the waters there in Galilee as he's about to sink. Lord, save me. The Syrophoenician woman, she comes. Help me. Simple prayers that touches the heart of God. Father, glorify your name. Then came there a voice from heaven. Marvelous what God can do, isn't it? You can speak to him and he can speak back to you. We had that tongue and interpretation the other day, wasn't it? And I'd said just before the tongue and interpretation, I feel that I've walked in silence for quite some time now. And then in the interpretation, to him who has said that he has walked in silence, to him I say, I have been speaking, but you've not heard. It's a very humbling thing. And you go back and you double check and you look at different areas in your life. And I'd taken 2 or 3 books on holiday. I left the books alone. I just read through with David on the occasions that God spoke to him. Going through 1 Samuel, going through 2 Samuel. Just looking at the thing, reading the Psalms with him. Spent all my time when I did read. Not all my time, but all the time that I did read. I was reading the scriptures because of what God had said. I have been speaking, but you've not been listening. Funnily enough, in Psalm 38 or 39 today, he says, I am as a deaf man, and I am mute. Have you felt like that sometimes, that you don't know what to say to God? So you're almost struck down. And your ears are stopped that you can't hear a thing with the hubbub of the noise, not outside, but inside. The noise that rattles on in your heart and in your mind. When you go to pray, you start thinking about things that have no relevance to what you're doing there in your room or at the kitchen sink or wherever you're praying. Father, glorify your name. Then came there a voice from heaven. I have both glorified it and will glorify it again. In the life of Christ, the Father was glorified. He was glorified. And then in the death of Christ, the Father was glorified. I said this morning, there is a verse that applies to each and every one of us concerning these different instances that we have of the glory of God. And this is the verse: whatever you do all to the glory of God. I've told you before of the arguments. Never mind about the girls having a crack at each other when backs are turned. The men are pretty good at it too. Don't worry about that. We can get quite as nasty as well. Perhaps even more so. And the arguments that used to go on about the getting a cup of coffee on a Monday morning. Whose turn is it? And the argument, really arguments. I did it last week. And so one morning, I was there, I said, Lord, is it possible for me to get this coffee for you? Now that sounds almost blasphemous. It sounds almost stupid. As Andrew would say to Jean, you can't pray like that when you would ask God to keep Monday dry for washing. You can't pray to, well, why not? And so I simply prayed. I said, Lord, can I get this coffee for you? And I volunteered. They said, and they were protecting me now, but you went Friday. I said, no, I want to go. I'm walking up the steps. There were 4 flights of stairs to go into the next building, the telephone exchange next door down there in Cardiff. And I remember the tears coursing down my cheeks, simply that I was doing something for the glory of God. You can do the menial of tasks, and God can be involved in it. And so we find here that he was glorified in the life of Christ, and he was glorified in his death. And not only that, there's not only this thought of glory. We tend to think of glory being something insular, something that be in your room. I remember the first time I felt the presence of God by myself. I was in the toilet in the tower plant, kneeling on my knees, waiting for the 22 minutes past train to go down. Well, that was the marker that told me it's time to get up and out. I rushed through my sandwiches, and I was kneeling on my knees and praying there, and the presence of God came down in that toilet room. Sounds wrong, sounds blasphemous, sounds low, but that's what happened. God can move in these wonderful ways, and he's glorified in his death. And there was a spirit of worship there, just in that locked little closet. A spirit of praise that was with me just for that time. As soon as I went to tell Granville about it, it began to lift off. I said, blow Granville, I'm going back up the toilet again. And so we find that it's not insular, as that instance was that I just gave. But this glory is to reach out. Because in verse 37, I think it is, it says this, and if I be lifted up, I'll draw all men to me. You see the same twofold purpose again. Look. The glory of his name and for all men to know. They knew full well what Jesus was talking about. It wasn't hidden language, this lifted up. If you've got a New King James in your margin, it'll tell you what that phrase lifted up means. It means crucified. That's why they asked him and they said, but the Lord tells us that Christ will live forever. How can he die? They knew exactly what he was talking about. It's his death. If I be lifted up, if I be crucified, I'll draw all men unto me. Isn't it incredible how God works? Paul talks about the foolishness of preaching. He talks of the thought in the Greek mind, the Roman mind, the Jewish mind that says the cross is something so ignoble, so worthless, something that the word wouldn't touch with a barge pole. And yet that's where the glory comes from. There is a fountain filled with blood, drawn from Emmanuel's veins, and sinners plunged beneath that flood lose all their guilty stains. The cross is the fulcrum of God's glory. It's an amazing thing, isn't it? Amazing what the cross can do. Absolutely amazing what it does. Jesus says, I'll draw all men unto me. Paul and Isaiah are a little bit conservative in their language, speaking of it. Isaiah says this, he says, by my righteous servant he shall justify many. Isn't that very conservative, isn't it? He shall justify many. And then he goes on to say in verse 12 of Isaiah 53, he says this, he says, he shall bear the sin of many. The Bible also tells us that he came to take the sin of the whole world. The capacity is there to save the world. But the truth says that many shall come, and so their voice is a conservative voice. Paul in Romans chapter 5, that difficult chapter that we looked at just a few weeks ago, he says, by his obedience, or by the obedience of one man, many shall be made righteous. And it sounds so small in comparison to the way Jesus is intending it, that he'll draw all men unto him. And so we read then that John, far, far more expressive. He loses all his conservatism and he expresses himself. And in Revelation chapter 5, that wonderful chapter talking about the Lamb of God, this is what it says. Where's it gone? Chapter 5 verse 9. You were slain and have redeemed us to God by your blood. Listen now. Out of every tribe, out of every tongue, out of every people and nation. And you have made us kings and priests, and we shall reign on the earth. What a marvelous thing. Now you see what the many is. The many that will be justified. The many that will have their sins forgiven. The many that will be made righteous. They'll come from every tribe, every tongue, every people, every nation. They'll come from all the world. And I, if I be lifted up, will draw all men unto me. And God's purpose will be fulfilled. It's a wonderful thought. How this event at Calvary that took place over 2,000 years ago can still affect us today. It can change me. It can change you. I was very tempted at the beginning of the service just to pick out 4 or 5 volunteers and say, right, in a couple of words, I'm just going to ask you a few sentences. When did you get saved? Well, so and so. What was going on when you got saved? Some of you will be saying this, I was grieving a loved one. Some of you are saying this, I was not knowing what church to go to. Some of you will say this, we were going to get married. Some of you will say something else, I was in Sunday school. You could say something else and say, well, I was just rebelling against my parents, trying to prove that I could be what I wanted to be. That's when God saved me. And so we got all these different ways of seeing it. And so different individuals have got these testimonies. When did you get saved? I can name the day, I can name the hour, I can name the moment, I can name where I am. What was going on? I was there to get my, not my bars called out, what do they call it? Bands. Get my bars called out. Get my bands called out. It's amazing what God can do, isn't it? This boy Lloyd. You know, that's the time when you're likely to blame everyone and everything. The time when you're likely to turn around, it's not many turn around and say, well, why shouldn't it be me? There's not many of us that can turn around and say that, but, well, why shouldn't it be me? And in the midst of adversity, on dialysis, he gives his heart to Christ. And so these different things that goes on. Psalm 22. It depicts the suffering of the Master. Talks of things that they'd not heard of yet. Crucifixion hadn't been invented at this point. I understand it was the Persians that invented crucifixion. I understand that to be so. I don't know if that's correct. But certainly crucifixion was not known at the time of the writing of Psalm 22. In the way that it's depicted. And he talks of the different things that goes on there at the cross. And it's like as if he's there. There. Hundreds of years later. 1,500 years later, there at the cross, looking at it, and then coming back and saying what was going on, but he wasn't there. Under the inspiration of God, he talks about this, about Christ being forsaken. And of the different things that goes on there, the dogs that surround him, the bulls that surround him, the lion that surrounds him. All these different things, his hands being pierced and his feet being pierced. He talks about being like a worm, a man that is beyond recognition. And so he talks about these things, and then he says this: in this moment where you speak or read of this one that was crucified, then he comes up with this in verse 27. From this cross, from this suffering, all the ends of the world shall remember and turn to the Lord. All the families shall worship before him. It will spread around the world. It's lovely when you get an email from Kathleen and Daniel telling of the ongoings that's going on in Nigeria. Why Ethiopia? I'm not quite sure, but Nigeria. And they tell of people are still coming to their house now to share with them in the sufferings that have gone on since the loss of their daughter Ellie. They're still coming. The other day they had 30 people at the house and stayed there for a day or two. How do you do that? Can you imagine Judith do that? No offense to her, but I know what she's like when you invite someone around and say, well, wait a minute, we haven't moved it. The windows, the mirrors, all these different, I've got to do the bath, I've got to buff it up. Not the bath, the bathroom. Got to do all these things. 30 odd people. Lovely to hear of how the Church of God is going on in the world in difficult times. Out of every tribe and tongue and people and nation they'll come. I'll draw all men to me, and the Father will be glorified. All the nations of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord. All the families of the nations shall revere. What a marvelous time that'll be, won't it? What a day that will be. What a day. Well, closing verse. We've come to the close. Philippians 2. You can't really have this subject without looking at Philippians 2, because it incorporates everything. Jesus became obedient to death, even the death of the cross. Therefore God has highly exalted him and given him a name above all names, that at the name of Jesus every knee shall bow. Listen now. Every knee shall bow. Every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. He brings it all in together. This twofold purpose of reaching out to all the nations to bring glory to God. He did it through Christ. Father, glorify your name. Listen, son, I've glorified it, and I'll glorify it again. Where? At the cross. He'll draw all men there at that wooden gibbet, where there would be cursing and everything else that was going on there. The grace of God would flow from that point. You say, is there room? There's room at the cross for me, room at the cross for you. There's no argy-bargy there. There's plenty of time, plenty of room, plenty of grace. May God grant it to us in these days as well.